Hello and welcome to the Car Care Auto Review channel, and welcome to the 2023 Jeep Compass. Now, when you look at this Compass from this year and the previous year, they look exactly the same. However, in 2023, Jeep changed the powertrain. The engine and the transmission is new. Our reviews are focused on the technical aspects of the car. So we're going to take a look at this new powertrain and the rest of the car as well while we're here to see if Jeep did good changes or bad changes right after this. Let's start our technical review under the hood, which in the 23 Compass, we have an all-new powertrain. So let's start with the engine. This is a 2-liter, 4-cylinder, dual overhead, turbocharged, direct injected engine. Let's start with the mechanical construction and we'll go from there. At the very top, you have a plastic valve cover. This is a pretty standard thing in the automotive industry these days. This particular plastic valve cover does feel like on the cheaper side. I hope it holds and we don't have issues with it. Does have an integrated oil separator in it. It's part of the valve cover. That is also pretty standard. The cylinder head is a single piece cylinder head. Doesn't have any really thrills about it. Regular cam caps, and the valve cover doesn't integrate into the cam caps in any way, shape, or form, which is good. This engine does have hydraulic lifters and it does have roller rockers, which is also something becoming the norm in the automotive industry, which is a good thing. These are pretty reliable. We shouldn't have any issues. Then we move into the variable valve timing. This engine has dual variable valve timing on the intake and the exhaust. They're both oil controlled, but they are the simple oil controlled. So basically the timing gear, the bolt that holds it, is the oil control valve. And then there's a solenoid on the outside that is electronically controlled. It pushes on that oil control valve or pulls on it to change the oil flow inside the gear, and that's how it changes timing. Pretty simple design, and I like to see that because we don't have a lot of oil passages through the valve cover and whatnot. It's pretty simple and pretty simple to service as well. Then we move on to the timing chain, which this engine has two. One of them goes from the cams to the crank. This is an interference engine, of course. Most modern chain engines are interference. The second chain, though, is pretty interesting. So this engine being a 4-cylinder, it has two balance shafts, but the orientation of the second chain is pretty interesting. So from the crank, the second chain goes to the right balance shaft and then to another sprocket for the oil pump. But wait, what about the other balance shaft, the left one? Well, here's where things get interesting. At the back of the oil pump, there's a gear, and then the left balance shaft, gear-to-gear drive to the oil pump. Pretty interesting design. I don't know why they did it this way, and why does this engine, which is anything but refined, it vibrates a lot, has two balance shafts and it still vibrates, but that's the way they did it. This engine is direct injected only. And this interesting thing about it is they went good and bad. Let me explain. So usually direct injected systems will have a fuel pump in the tank, which just sends the fuel from the fuel tank all the way to the front. Then another high pressure fuel pump that pressurizes that fuel to a very high pressure. Well, this one has that pump on top of the valve cover, which is actually the best place for it. Very easy to service. It's right there. It's not buried somewhere in the engine. But what they didn't do well is the location of the direct injectors. Normally, the good setup would be at the side of the cylinder head, out of the way, kind of hidden from the general top area. This one has it on the valve cover. So removing the valve cover on this engine becomes a double labor, because now you have to remove the high pressure fuel pump, which in fairness, it is not a big deal. But the injectors, you have to remove them, and they absolutely happen to be plastic made. And now you have to replace the seals, and as they get older, they get stuck, and because they're plastic, they'll break, and it adds all this unnecessary complication to achieve absolutely nothing special. The truth have to be said. This engine is also turbocharged with my favorite location of the turbocharger. So most turbocharged engines will have the turbo in the back, the intake in the front. This one is the other way around. The turbo is right in the front, which is actually a better place for service. Something very interesting about this turbo, it doesn't have an exhaust manifold. It's kind of a specific design, actually orientated for performance, not really for longevity or ease of service, but it is in the front, so that's good. It is coolant and oil cooled, pretty standard there. It does have an electronic wastegate. And the intercooler here is liquid to air, which is a good thing. So you don't really have a lot of piping. The intercooler lives in the intake manifold, and just the charge pipe goes directly to the intake, and that's about it. Speaking of the intercooler, let's talk about the cooling system and how that works with the intercooler. So this car has two cooling systems, and for such a modern engine that is 2023 and everything is the latest and the greatest, it has the simplest cooling system for the engine you can ever imagine. Mechanical water pump, thermostat, no valves, no fancy thermal management, nothing, just standard stuff, which is good. Then there is a second cooling system, which is completely separate. That one is for the intercooler. It's the low temperature circuit. That circuit uses its own electric water pump that circulates the coolant, separate radiator. Pretty standard with turbo cars that uses a liquid to air intercooler. Now let's talk about the transmission. This car has a different transmission than the previous generation or previous model year. This is an 8-speed transmission. Very strange decisions. Usually auto manufacturers seem to be in a race to increase their gears as we go up. This one dropped. It went from the ZF, not 9-speed transmission, to the 8-speed here. There's a lot of speculation and kind of mystery around where this transmission exactly came from, and Jeep doesn't seem to confirm or deny anything. Some have suggested that this transmission comes from Hyundai. And the reason they made that assumption is it matches the gear ratios exactly of that of a Hyundai transmission that shares a similar name. Did Jeep get this transmission from Hyundai? It remains unknown, but it's definitely not a ZF transmission, and kind of a strange decision, but that's what they decided to do. This transmission really is a no-thrill transmission. It's an 8-speed transmission. Torque converter does have an electric oil pump in addition to the mechanical one, so when you have a start-stop event, you can continuously have the pressure, so when it does start up again, you have pressure already. Let's talk about this powertrain kind of from a perspective of driving and what they did. The one word I would describe this drivetrain as, it's unrefined. And the reason I say that is, you put two balance shafts, yet you stop at a traffic light, this engine shakes. This is basically a brand new car here. This engine shakes. So the mounting, it's not the engine itself and the balance shaft, it's the mounting that it's not really refined. And then occasionally this transmission would start hunting for gears, and then it starts shaking, like it puts it in such a low gear, this engine, if you don't spool the turbo, doesn't really have a lot of power, and just starts lagging and shaking and jerking. It's like, this is not refined at all. And then we move past this stuff, and just me as a mechanic kind of looking under the hood. There are a lot of strangeness going on here. And I'll start with one that is not mechanical. If you want to get a good laugh, look right here on the cowl. You will see an imprint of a lizard. I wish they would have not done this and spend a little bit more fixing some of the stuff here, but that's what they decided to do. And if you are a mechanic working in this and you're afraid of lizards, now you know where not to look. Let's move on to some other stuff. Historically, engine computers used to be inside the car because we didn't have the technology to weatherproof them. Then they moved under the hood, and they got smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, this one has engine computer under the hood, but it's massive. I don't know why a powertrain that just got redone has this massive computer that just lives here. That's okay, not the end of the world. Then you look at the passenger side, you will see the test port for the evap. It literally looks like a fuel line that is capped, because that's what it is, but that's the evap test port, in case you were wondering. And then the battery. The battery have this blanket around it. This is the comment in the automotive industry is, this is the first thing that's going to get thrown out when we change the battery, because it does absolutely nothing. I don't know why they do that. And then looking around everything feels very flimsy, not really high quality. But one observation, if you look at the air filter, it has multiple bolts. This is the place where you want them not to go all bolts. You want them to put little clips to make service easy. No, they put not one, not two, they put 5 bolts to hold the air filter. Just for you to change, you have to take 5 bolts off. Not the end of the world, but again, here's what's going to happen in the future. These will strip the bottom, and now you can't hold it anymore. Clips would have been much better. Moving past that though, to a few more things. The orientation of the belt. So I don't recall how many cars have the AC compressor all the way up. This has a compressor at the top where normally you'd expect the alternator to be, and then the alternator all the way in the back in a very difficult position to change. These are the decisions that auto manufacturers make that just makes me wonder, were they even thinking? I don't think they were, because you'd want the compressor down. That's not an item that you're going to be servicing regularly, but an alternator is a wear item. This is where auto manufacturers don't think about this stuff. Then we move past that. The insulation here behind the fender is such a cheap and flimsy, and it's just sticking out, looks horrible. That's okay, not the end of the world. And then there's this little, basically foam flap that has a cutout for the hood. I don't know what this stuff does, but just doesn't feel very high quality. We start seeing this and the one-time use clamps everywhere. It makes you feel like, is this a disposable car? That's the feeling mechanics get when they look at this stuff. And then one last thing, and this is just a small thing. As a mechanic looking underneath this hood, things are extremely busy for a four-cylinder. I'm starting to see kind of a trend of this. Why do we need to cram this entire engine bay, which is a little bit on the smaller side? I understand this is a smaller car, but this is a very busy engine bay. Access is really not a thing. You barely have any room to access anything on the side. You barely have any room to access anything in the front. And the back is really hidden behind the cowl. It's just, the only thing that's going to do is add more cost to your repair, because everything you want to do, you have to tear so much to get the simplest thing out. It just, I don't know why auto manufacturers love to do this. Let's take a look underneath the 23 Jeep Compass, but small disclaimer before we start. It is agreed upon that if you really want to know the true story of a car, look in places where nobody looks, which is underneath a car. So there are some things that we're going to see here that tell us the whole story. Let's start from the beginning. First, this is a little bit of an older design of car, so there's no cover. Everything's wide open. And then I am greeted by the first mystery. This is a flex pipe. Basically, this is an invention that is made to break one day and cause exhaust leaks. And the best part is, it is already at a torque down angle, so it's already loaded. And that is not the greatest idea on the planet. That's okay. Then we move to the engine pan, which is good that it is steel. So this is a little stronger, not all aluminum, although the upper pan is aluminum. That's okay. This is a steel oil pan. But this is where things start to take a turn to the interesting stuff. We look at the transmission. The transmission has a front pan, which is okay, although it makes service very difficult, but that's okay. But then curiosity starts to come in. I would like to know, what exactly is this hole in the casting right here? There's a definite hole in the casting right there where you can see the axle. Cooling? It almost looks like that casting piece was so weak that it broke. Doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. That's okay. Let's talk about the front suspension, then we'll move to a lot more interesting stuff. This is a single piston caliper, brake in the front, aluminum knuckle, ball joints actually separate from the control arm, which is a good thing. This is a steel control arm. This is a standard McPherson design. Pretty simple design. Everything is pretty simple, except the bearing will weld itself to this knuckle, because that's what dissimilar metals do. That's why aluminum knuckle, as much as people like to see aluminum knuckles, they're actually not the best idea for longevity, but that's a lot of auto manufacturers doing that. Then we move to the transfer case, which is this over-elaborate contraption that has multiple motors. Basically, this is a transfer case that can disengage. Adds way too much complication to accomplish absolutely nothing. That's the truth have to be said. Basically, this transfer case can disengage the drive shaft or engage it. That's okay. Perhaps the rear differential is just always connected and always turning, so they disconnect it from the front. Well, that's not the case. Let's keep going and you'll see what I mean. Then we move past that, and over here in this general area where on top of the transfer case proudly lives the starter. I don't know why anyone thought this is a good idea, because should you need to replace the starter of this, I mean, as a mechanic, I'm just looking at this, you have to either remove the transfer case, which is a lot of work, or remove the alternator, which is also in a very tight spot. As we talked about, it's all the way in the back of the engine. Why would they do this? Put the starter right on top of the transfer case where it's an inaccessible place. Starter is somewhat of a rare item on cars. Eventually you're going to replace it. This will make it like a nightmare. There's no other way to say it. That's okay. Moving on from that to the exhaust. Every time you see an exhaust clamp like this is a problem waiting to happen, and this is a brand new car. We already have leaks from it. That's okay, small leaks, not a big deal. But then there's something very curious about this, the design of this car. You notice that the drive shaft is offset. It's not really centered in the car. Very interesting design. As we go to the back, you'll see a little bit more. But let's talk about the quality of things. You notice none of the floor is covered. It's all wide open. We do have this very flimsy insulation right here. But I want to bring your attention to a few things. The finishing. The finishing of cars underneath is very important to some manufacturers. Some manufacturers, it doesn't seem like it bothers them, because this is not good finishing of this car that cost $40,000. And the same thing here. I do not trust that for rust treatment. Honestly, this just doesn't look good. But that's what they deemed okay for this car. Then we go all the way in the back and we look at the differential. Just a very small differential. It does have a motor on it to disconnect it. So I feel like we went too much. You have a motor here, motors in the front for the transfer case to disconnect this, to disconnect that. And I don't see the system very capable of anything like serious off-roading. It simply isn't. This is a tiny little differential with tiny little axles. You put any kind of load on it, you're going to start wearing things out. This is not meant for heavy off-roading, but we have all this complication just because it has a name Jeep. This is the problem. This is why these cars are getting expensive, because they have so much of this that does absolutely nothing. That's the truth, folks. Then we look at the rear suspension. Aluminum knuckle, again, multi non-aluminum arms, which is good. This actually has a McPherson rear strut, which is something slowly going away from the automotive business. Interesting design. It's pretty simple suspension. You do have a single piston caliper with the electronic parking brake, which is pretty good. This is a very good design. We got rid of all the shoes and the rotor hat and all that. This does have a rear sway bar, which is good. But my problem with a car like this is the finishing of things here and just the little stuff. There's so many things that just looking here, this stuff's not gonna last. And that's the problem. And you see it, it's obvious stuff. I look at things like this right here. I wonder what this tape is. Is this the factory tape that was left over? And then everything just doesn't inspire confidence and of longevity. And that is the problem with cars like this. Let's take a look at the outside of the Jeep Compass. And something to be said about this design, it is a very standard, generic SUV look. Something to be said about this, it feels too narrow, and I like how they overemphasize the Jeep grille here. Wish they would have made it smaller. It would have looked a little bit more not in your face, if that's the word, but that is a bit much. The radar sensor is right here. So it's very low for a big SUV like this. That is a very low spot. It's kind of front row seat for any hits or anything. Then we move over to the side. The fit and finish of some of the panels could be better. And I mean, I'm just looking at this gap. There's a huge gap and another huge gap here that gets smaller. That's not the end of the world, but that's how you tell they were not really heavily interested in making this good fitting. And that's something historic with Jeep. As we move to the side, it says Compass right here. This does have the smart key, only the front, which is understandable for a car in this segment, although at this price, I wish they would have at least added that. But as we wrap around, in the back, same thing, very standard looking. I like the emphasis on the 4x4. trying to tell you that this is an off-roading thing. It is not. That's the truth have to be said. As we looked underneath it, it's not really meant for off-roading. Let's look in the back. It is a power operated door with an interesting thing. Remember, this is an older model. This does not have the integrated motor into the shocks. This actually has the design that is a little worse. So there's a motor here and this little arm that pushes it. What this does, and the reason why the automotive industry kind of is getting away from this puts tremendous load on the door on one side, and over time with use, it actually bends the frame of the door. That is something pretty common with doors that use that style motor. So handle this door with care, because they do tend to shift off their hinges and they bend. That is something common. It's because of the single motor design. Then there is what I call the silly stuff. If you look here, you have the kind of the imprint of the Willys Jeep. And I have a feeling, and something that I will mention here might make some folks upset. Same thing here. You have it here as well. I feel like the designers of the Compass have never really driven a Willys Jeep when they put this all over this. This is a small crossover. You can't even call it an SUV. You know, sensible, meant to take people to work and back. It does have all-wheel drive, good in snow, and very, very light off-road driving. You cannot compare this to a Wrangler, let alone a Willys Jeep. But they love to do this. This is all, of course, marketing stuff. Makes absolutely no sense. Then we look in the back here. Plenty of space, but I feel like there's a lot of intrusion from the wheel well, and this is where this car is narrow. So you have a lot of space taken up by the wheel wells here. We look here. This car, of course, does not have a spare tire. So you do have the inflate kit though, and this little funnel, because this car has a capless system. We're going to look at it in a second. Some manufacturers that have very reliably made cars will have a very over elaborate toolkit. Jeep is not one of those, and they only give you a little screwdriver. I guess that was their, I don't know if that was intentional. That was pretty interesting. Then this is not just Jeep, this is Jeep and Chrysler. They love to put their closing button instead of here, right here. So you have to press it and just kind of run away, wait for it to beep, and then it closes. I don't know why they did it this way, but that's the way they do it. Then we go over to the door, and this is, it works, but I don't really like it. They don't have a gas cap, and this is the very interesting contraption here that seals. It does work, but it's not the best idea in the planet. I think a gas cap would have been perfectly fine. Let's talk about the interior of the 23 Jeep Compass. And this interior is very basic, very down to earth, very easy to use. It does have one thing that is interesting. Historically, Jeep has not had the nicest interiors in the planet. They're usually a little bit on the cheaper side. This one feels a little bit better put together, and that have to be said. On the center stack over here, infotainment system is first. It is a very good infotainment system, it has to be said. Very intuitive, very quick, works very well. And that is something that they've been doing really good. Same thing with the gauge. This does have manual gauges, not a full screen, but it's a pretty large screen in the middle, and it's pretty customizable and intuitive, and that is pretty cool. The cool thing about this car is it's a very simple car, and it's an easy one to live with. I mean, you look here in the middle, all your HVAC controls here in the middle. They're just physical buttons. You don't have anything through the screen, which is very good. Something interesting though, the volume knob and kind of the radio is integrated into this. The volume knob has a mute button right underneath it, and here you have a screen off. I haven't seen that in other manufacturers. That's actually a pretty good idea. Shifter is a physical shifter, which is very cool and nice. No rotary dial, none of that. And then right next to it you have this very cute little flimsy button that changes the drive mode from auto to snow to sand and mud. Of course, the Jeep, they had to put that, although please don't drive in sand and mud in this because it's not going to go very far. And then in the middle, underneath that, you have a lot of blank switches, even though this is almost $40,000. And right next to it, you have four-wheel drive lock. Let's just reiterate that this is not a four-wheel drive car. It's an all-wheel drive. Please don't do heavy off-roading and mistake this for a Wrangler. It's not really meant for that. The seats, They're not really real leather, they're just vinyl. They are pretty comfortable, they are pretty basic, they don't have heavy bolstering, so it is a pretty comfortable seat. Something to be said though, there is this strange material on the dash and it wraps into the doors as well. To me, it looks like a jeans material. I don't know, some auto manufacturers are starting to use this, something about it. It looks odd, looks completely out of place, and it just looks like a complete last minute add-on. I don't understand it, but it is here. Let's talk about the back seat. I am 5'7", this is my driving position. I have some knee room, which is good. I have a lot of headroom though. That is pretty cool. One thing though, this car almost has like a bubble roof, so entering here, if you're taller, you might hit your head, but once you're in, it's not actually a bad place to be. The seat's pretty high off the ground, so my inner thighs are resting on the seat. But there's something interesting. If you look at the shape of the seat, it kind of has like a dip in the middle, and then you have these raised parts. It's almost like they're trying to tell you it's preferable that you only sit two people here, but if you must, somebody's getting punished with the middle. The tunnel is not very high, which is good, but still, you're going to be basically sitting on these two humps, and you're going to get a shorter seat. I guess I hope you get the hint. It's better to put two people here than three. Something interesting though, even though this is a smaller car, you do have two HVAC vents here and some USB and USB-C. I guess adds a little bit of niceness to the back of this seat. Let's talk about some things I do not like about the Jeep Compass. So here's the biggest thing. Normally, when a manufacturer changes the powertrain kind of mid-cycle, they haven't updated the car, they didn't do it's exactly the same car, they just changed the powertrain. It's always not done well, and there will always be problems to follow. And this powertrain, it's not refined. I feel like it's half done, because you go drive this car at light throttle, kind of constant speed, lower speeds, it starts just shaking back and forth. Almost like the transmission is trying to hunt and the engine has too little power because the turbos haven't spooled up. It's not a refined powertrain. And occasionally it'll just start shaking for one reason or another and hunt for gears and all that. So I'm trying to understand what exactly they did changing from the previous one, which was not the most reliable powertrain in the world, to this one. And the biggest concern here is the look of the car. Looks are objective, but this has a very generic look. If you want a Jeep, buy a Wrangler. Even a Grand Cherokee looks a little better. This one is not the best looking one. And then the interior, while it is slightly better on the quality side from other Jeeps that we've seen, it still feels cheap and generic. And that's okay. Not every car has to have luxurious materials and everything, but this one, for its price range, speaking of the price range, this one, as tested, is almost $40,000. And the cheapest one you can have is almost $30,000. That's a lot of money for a car that's not strong on reliability, not really strong on looks or features, although the infotainment system is great, but it's not a big car after all. That's the problem with the Jeep Compass. The change they did doesn't feel like a change at all. If anything, it feels kind of a downgrade and just the price going up. So should you buy the 2023 Jeep Compass? Folks, this one is barely okay. Let me elaborate. So the first thing is, the biggest change in this is the powertrain, which is a little bit of a letdown. Doesn't feel as refined. This transmission, kind of a big question mark. And of course, reliability is not a strong point for Jeep, so this is not a long-term car. The other thing is, which is to me is the biggest problem, the price. This, as tested right here, is almost $40,000. And the cheapest model you can get from this, the base model, with destination fees, is almost $30,000. I'm sorry, at that price range, going from 30 to 40, you're into the neighborhood of some serious SUVs that are not only better built, they're also larger. And leaving everybody else out, in the Jeep family, you can get a Grand Cherokee base model for slightly over $40,000. So if you're going to option this out, might as well get the bigger car. This is the problem. Normally, these little Jeeps, they're not the most reliable cars in the world. They're not the longest lasting, but they're okay. You can buy them short term, enjoy them, and then move on. But at this price point, it kind of goes out the window. Usually these little Jeeps, they're cheaper in price, and that's where they make up some of that. But this is a little too expensive with a powertrain that is unrefined, untested, and the historic record of unreliability. This becomes a little bit in a bad spot. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you. And you have yourself a wonderful day.